Welcome back to the deep dive. We dig into complex research so you don't have to, giving you that shortcut to really understanding tricky topics. Today, it's something affecting millions, billions maybe, worldwide. Myopia. Short-sightedness. It's exploding. If you wear glasses, contacts, you're familiar with refractive errors, they're everywhere. But we're going deeper, past the prescription. We want to focus on the single most important predictor for your long-term vision health.
Yeah, and that predictor, that core metric, is axial length, or AL. It sounds technical, but it's simple conceptually. Most moderate to severe myopia happens because the eyeball itself just grows too long. It physically stretches. So light doesn't focus where it should on the retina. And understanding that lengthening, tracking it, predicting it, that's the real game changer here.
Right. And the work we're diving into today, it's groundbreaking because it gives us, finally, a kind of gold standard for watching that growth. We're looking at a huge study. Massive, really. It pooled data from 3 big European groups. You've got Generation R, ALS PAC, Rotterdam Study Third, all told more than 12,000 people. And from that, they built the first proper normative growth curves for European eyes.
Exactly. And this is really mission critical for you, the listener, because we're talking serious risk here. High myopia, and we define that usually as an axial length of 26 millimeters or more. It massively bumps up the risk of really bad, irreversible problems later. Stuff like retinal detachment, myopic maculopathy, things that can genuinely threaten sight.
So this research, it's about building an early warning system, catching those eyes that are growing too fast before they hit that danger zone.
Okay, let's get into it then. To know what's dangerous, we first need that baseline. What does normal eye growth even look like for a kid in Europe? Well, the data shows most of the lengthening happens pretty early. In those preschool and early school years, it's quite rapid. Looking at the average numbers, at age 6, the mean AL was 22.36 millimeters. By age 9, it's jumped to 23.0 millimeters.
Okay, so that's almost, 3/4 of a millimeter in just 3 years? That sounds like quite a bit for something so small.
It is, relatively speaking. It's a significant growth spurt. But then things change.
It slows down as they get older.
Yeah, significantly. Between age 9 and age 15, the eye only adds, on average, about another third of a millimeter. The mean hits 23.41 millimeters. And then into adulthood, the oldest group they looked at was around 57 years old. The average length sort of settles around 23.67 millimeters. So yeah, the vast majority of that stretching is done before they even hit their teens, mostly before age 10, really.
Interesting. So the length is changing a lot early on, but other parts of the eye must be adjusting, right? Otherwise, everyone would be born needing thick glasses.
That's a key point. One fascinating finding was about the cornea, that clear front window of the eye. While the axial length is shooting up, the corneal radius of curvature, or CR, stays remarkably stable on average. Its steepness, its curve, doesn't change much across the age groups. This tells us that most of the growth driving towards myopia, it's happening at the back. The eye is lengthening backwards.
You mentioned it stabilizes in adulthood, but did they see any growth later on, like after adolescence?
Yes, and this was a really crucial insight about growth after age 15. They found that significant AL growth after 15 happened almost entirely in the upper half of the population, percentile-wise. So kids whose eyes were already longer tended to keep growing longer, whereas the eyes in the lowest percentiles, the shortest ones, they barely changed after age 6.
Huh. So the ones starting shorter stayed relatively short, but the ones starting longer kept going.
Exactly. It's like the trajectory gets set early. The longest eyes in the study, for example, grew over 2.5 millimeters between age 6 and adulthood. The shortest ones. They grew less than a single millimeter in that whole time. It really highlights predisposition.
That definitely suggests if you're on track for myopia early, that track often continues, maybe even into the 20s. And I remember reading there were differences based on sex, too.
Yes, absolutely. Gender was a significant variable. They had to create separate charts. Females, on average, consistently had shorter axial length than males at every age point they measured. They also tended to have steeper corneas, a smaller CR, and lower ratios of axial length to corneal radius. So clinicians really need to use those gender-specific charts to accurately assess where a child stands. You can't compare boys and girls directly on the same curves.
Okay, so we have the normal picture now. Average growth, how it slows down, the gender differences. Now let's get to the core predictive part, using that baseline to spot the danger sign. When does a child's eye growth jump off that normal track? This is where those percentile curves become like an early warning system, right? What's the signal?
The most powerful signal wasn't just having a long eye at age 9. It was the speed of growth between age 6 and age 9. Specifically, children whose axial length percentile increased by more than 10 percentiles during those 3 years. That was the red flag. That jump showed dramatically higher risk.
Wow, okay. More than 10 percentiles jump in just 3 years. That's very specific. What happened to those kids?
The results were pretty stark. Among those kids with that accelerated growth, that big percentile jump, almost half, 45.8%, were already myopic by the time they hit age 9. Now compare that to the kids whose percentile rank stayed relatively stable, didn't jump more than 10 percentiles. In that group, only 4.8% were myopic at age 9.
Goodness, that's what, 9 times the risk?
Yeah.
Just identified by tracking the velocity of growth? Not even the absolute length necessarily, but the change.
Exactly. Velocity is key. And you can see in the raw growth numbers, too. Between 6 and 9 years old, the kids who were myopic showed the fastest elongation rate, average 0.34 millimeters per year. Compare that to kids with normal vision, emmetropic kids. Their eyes grew at 0.19 millimeters per year. And hyperopic kids, farsighted, grew even slower, 0.15 millimeters per year. So that high-risk group is stretching almost twice as fast as the normal group in those critical years.
So let's put this into practice. A clinician measures a 9-year-old, they plot them on these new charts, and they see this child is tracking along, say, the highest 10th percentile line for axial length for their age and gender. What does that actually mean in terms of their future risk, their risk as an adult?
Being up there consistently in that highest 10th percentile for AL for your age, that's a major warning. The study found it was associated with a 97% risk of eventually developing myopia in adulthood. And maybe even more worryingly, it carried a 23% risk, almost 1 in 4, of developing high myopia, that 26 millimeter length we talked about.
97% risk of myopia. That's almost a certainty just from an early measurement. That feels incredibly powerful and maybe a bit scary for parents. So this data, these charts, they feel revolutionary. How easy is it for, say, a regular optometrist to start using these? Are they practical?
Oh, absolutely. That's the goal. They really shift the clinical approach. An AL measurement used to be just data. Interesting maybe, but hard to interpret. Now with these normative charts, that number gets context. It becomes predictive. It lets clinicians quantify that risk of high myopia much earlier. And crucially, it lets them act. They can move towards prevention instead of just waiting for the myopia to get bad and then correcting it.
Okay, so action. What can actually be done? If a child is flagged as high risk, showing that accelerated growth, what are the options?
Well, the good news is interventions can work, especially if started early once that acceleration is spotted. Lifestyle changes are often the first step, specifically increasing time spent outdoors. There's solid evidence that helps slow down axial elongation. Then there are medical actions. Low-dose atropine eye drops are proving effective for many kids. And special types of contact lenses, multifocal or orthokertology lenses designed to manage how light focuses on the peripheral retina, seem to help curb that stretching signal too.
Right, so there are concrete things parents and doctors can do. That's encouraging. Now, you mentioned these are European growth curves. How do they stack up against other parts of the world, especially regions like East Asia where myopia rates are, well, sky high?
That comparison is really important. It shows why we need population-specific data. The median growth rates in this European study were pretty similar to other European studies, which makes sense. But they were distinctly lower than the average axial lengths seen in many studies of Asian children, particularly after age 7 or so. This reflects that much higher prevalence and risk of myopia in those populations. Their normal is longer, essentially. Interestingly, some older European studies, like from Norway, actually showed shorter average ALs than this current study, which might hint that even the European baseline could be slowly creeping up over generations.
That's a worrying thought. Before we wrap up the study details, did the researchers point out any major weaknesses or limitations in their own work, even with over 12,000 people?
They did. The strengths are clear, huge sample size, good methodology with autorefraction, tight age groups for kids, the gender stratification, all very solid. The main limitation they flagged was a data gap for young adults. Specifically, the 20 to 25-year-old range wasn't well represented. They noted this might mean the curve slightly underestimates growth during that final phase, when the eye might still be settling into its adult size. They also mentioned potential cohort effects, meaning maybe younger generations just inherently have a higher risk of myopia than the older generations they compared against in the Rotterdam study. Lifestyle changes over time, perhaps.
Okay, that makes sense. So let's boil this down. The big takeaway here seems to be axial length percentile charts are the new standard, for European kids at least. They let us monitor eye growth and predict future myopia risk. But the crucial warning sign isn't just being long, it's growing fast. That jump in percentiles between age 6 and 9, that's the alarm bell.
Precisely. It's the acceleration. And there's one more layer to this, something fascinating the researchers noted about how the eye tries to cope before things get out of hand. They looked at the relationship between the final prescription, the spherical equivalent, basically how much correction you need, and the ratio of axial length to corneal curvature, ALCR. And that relationship wasn't a straight line. It was actually weakest, less predictable, right around normal vision, emetropia.
Weakest when vision is normal. That sounds counterintuitive. Why would that be?
The likely reason is compensation. Before that rapid runaway axial growth really kicks in, other parts of the eye, especially the crystalline lens inside the eye, are actively working to adjust focus. They're compensating for minor mismatches between the cornea and the eye's length, trying to keep things sharp. It's like an internal autofocus system working overtime.
Wow.
The system tries to maintain normal vision structurally until the axial growth becomes too much, too fast, and overwhelms those compensation mechanisms. Then the myopia really takes hold.
Wow. So the eye is constantly fine-tuning itself. It makes you think about how sensitive that whole system is. And it really drives home the question of how lifestyle things, like being outdoors more, might interact with that baseline genetic tendency shown on the growth curves. Do those interventions maybe just help bolster the eye's own natural ability to compensate? Something definitely for you to think about.
Yeah, understanding those underlying mechanics, how the eye regulates itself, that's really key for developing even better prevention strategies down the line.
Absolutely. Well, this has been incredibly insightful. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We will catch you next time.